Carl Raymond Cogger was born to Thomas and Evelyn Cogger on the 24th of July 1893 at Macedon, Victoria. He was 8 years old when his family moved to Greenhill, about 10 kilometres north of Kyneton, where Carl's father Tom ran an agistment farm for the horses used in the family transport business based at Mount Macedon. Carl was the second oldest of the 10 children and attended the Greenhill Primary School, which no longer exists. Carl worked on the farm at Greenhill and was a frequent visitor to Mount Macedon through his work and visiting relatives, and it is here that he met Emmy, his future wife. Emmy's father, Stephen O'Callaghan, was born on Corfu, Greece, in 1864. However, his father died the year before his birth, and the family returned to England. On the 24th of May 1884, at the age of 20, Stephen sailed from Plymouth to Sydney on board the SS Texan on its maiden voyage, where he is listed as a nurseryman. 7 years later, in 1891, Stephen married Mary Billinghurst in Sydney, and 3 years later, Emmy was born in Kogarah, New South Wales. Between 1894 and 1909, the O'Callaghan family moved to Melbourne. Sometime later, the family relocated to Macedon, where Stephen worked at a grand home in Upper Macedon called Craignare, owned by the Ross family, and where Emmy also worked doing domestic duties. At the age of 21, he enlisted in the 4th Light Horse on the 18th of August 1914, standing 178 centimetres and weighing 70 kilograms. Carl left the farm and boarded a troop train at Kyneton Station, bound for an army camp at Broadmeadows. Carl embarked on board the Wiltshire in October 1914 as part of C Squadron. 4 days after he disembarked in Egypt, on the 2nd of December of that year, Emmy gave birth to their first child, Raymond Stephen, at Kyneton, Victoria. The 4th Light Horse was sent to Alexandria for training, and on the 22nd of May 1915, less than a month after the initial assault at Gallipoli, Carl landed at Anzac Cove and fought at Lone Pine. When in Gallipoli, Carl came across his cousin Ronald Cavalier, part of the 102nd Howitzer Battery. They had sailed from Melbourne on the same day on different ships. Carl met his cousin again when serving at Tel El Kebir in Egypt. He spent 6 weeks in hospital in Egypt, suffering from malaria and further time with lumbago and dysentery. Carl was transferred to the Australian Camel Training Unit in December 1916 and in April 1917 promoted to corporal. On the 17th of October 1917, Carl was part of the famous Charge of Beersheba, which is remembered as the last great cavalry charge. 1,000 Turkish riflemen in Beersheba had strong defensive positions and were supported by 9 machine guns and 2 aircraft. Commencing at dusk, the brigade stormed the town, using their bayonets as swords in a highly unconventional charge. The charge was part of the 3rd Battle of Gaza in Palestine. It was a vital component of the Allied forces' campaign to secure the Sinai Peninsula and ensure the shipping corridors along the Suez Canal remained open to Britain and its allies. In December of 1917, Carl was promoted to sergeant, and in October of 1918, the 4th Light Horse were the first troops to enter Damascus, followed by Lawrence of Arabia. This signalled the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, and Turkey signed an armistice with the Allies on the 30th of October, putting an end to the Allied campaign in the Middle East. Towards the end of the war, at Macedon, pin oak trees were planted in the Avenue of Honour, where 3 of the trees were dedicated to Carl and his 2 brothers, Emil and Ernest. At the ceremony, the Premier, Mr. Lawson, planted the first tree, and a 3rd was planted for Carl. Later in the ceremony, Councillor Bailey, President of the Gibson Shire Council, said of Carl, "Carl Cogger was one of those who had gone forth from an old and honoured family of the Mount to fight for freedom, liberty and right. And were there none of his mates remaining who were prepared to go and give him a rest?" Every effort was now being made to keep 4 divisions instead of the original 5, and he hoped others would follow Carl Cogger's grand example and offer their services to the Empire. Carl embarked at Suez on the 17th of December 1918 to return to Australia on the Port Hacking and arrived in Melbourne 6 weeks later. Ray recalls seeing his father for the very first time at the age of 5.
However, when the war ended and we had to go down and see the returned soldiers coming back, I can remember standing with my mother and my grandmother at Flinders Street Station, just beside Prince's Bridge, and we saw this procession of cars, and in the back seat of one car were 3 soldiers from the Light Horse with feathers in their cap and everything. In the middle was my old man. That's the first time I'd ever seen him. That was 1919, and then I was 5 years old.
Carl, Emmy and Ray returned to Greenhill to live with Carl's parents, Tom and Evelyn. Less than a month after his return home, Carl married Emmy Bellinghurst O'Callaghan in Carlton on the 26th of February 1919, with young Raymond as part of the wedding party. 9 months after the wedding, Sydney Edward, or Tim, was born in Petersham, Sydney, where Emmy's parents, the O'Callaghan's, were living. For a short time, Carl and Emmy lived in East Paran, and in December of 1919, Sergeant Major Cogger joined the Permanent Army and was attached to the 8th Light Horse Regiment in Benalla, in the northeast of Victoria, with a population of 3,000.
Beginning of 1919, my father joined the Permanent Army, so we had to go along with him, and he was stationed at Benalla. We'd never heard of Benalla, of course. We were 5 years old, well, anyway. Didn't know where the northeast was. But he was stationed there, and he wore a uniform all the time, and we stayed at a place named by the name of Truans.
Shortly after Tim was born and Emmy returned from Sydney, they left Truans to a home in Bridge Street opposite Leake's Cordial Factory. By this time there was quite a house full, as Carl's sister Dulcie, who was suffering from TB, had also moved in. Evelyn Marguerite was born on the 30th of November 1920, and at that time Carl was playing for the Benalla Football Club.
He used to tell us he trained with them. He used to tell me he trained with Essendon from Kyneton.
In January 1921, Carl was promoted to Warrant Officer of the 8th Light Horse. This was a senior management role focusing on the training, welfare and discipline of up to 200 soldiers. In September of that year, the Broken River broke its banks and Benalla was flooded. Harold Frederick was born on the 1st of March 1922, and Carl purchased a home they called Wahroonga, or Our Home.
Anyway, by this time when Harold was born, the old man had ventured into buying a house. And we went to Wahroonga. And you all know that eventually became the family house, Wahroonga. I can remember that vividly, the day we moved in, because I had to wheel Harold in the pram with Ev
toddling along,
and Tim on each side holding hanging onto the pram while I wheeled it round to Warunga. On along the road, and we didn't see anybody.
There's hardly any houses there.
The roads weren't made, and the pram was going bumpity-bump. Anyway, we got there, and it was a wonderful house, and served us
For the rest of
our child's lives.
Neville Keith was born on the 10th of January 1923, and Carl was elected to the committee to form the Benalla Cricket Club. On the 2nd of July 1925, Beryl Mary was born, and Carl and Emmy were regularly mentioned in the local paper social pages. They attended functions such as a military ball in Gurumbat, and Carl was in the news when rounding up calves his horse stumbled in a pothole, and he was thrown heavily to the ground, being rendered unconscious. The newspaper reports that he was found a little later suffering facial injuries, but seemed to have recovered the following day. Ray recalls the large paddock next door and what it meant to the children.
But to us it was a playground. Not only a playground, was it? We used to get wood for the fire.
Mushrooms.
We used to get mushrooms, yes. We used to get manure for the garden. And I had to do all this because these kids were too small. They used to come with me and drizzle because there were prickles. And of course we were all barefooted in those days. And it was the most prickliest paddock that you'd ever see. You couldn't walk on it with bare feet, you had to slide so that the prickles didn't get you. But however, it was a wonderful place because we had a cricket pitch, we had a running ground, there were stumps that they could sit on.
Over the next couple of years, Carl performed his civic duties, such as an official at the Anzac Day sports meeting, and Emmy as president of the Benalla West Primary School Mothers Club. Carl competed for the King's Medal shooting competition in Williamstown, representing the newly formed Benalla Rifle Club. And to top off the year in 1927, on the 10th of December, their seventh child, Edgar Ross, was born.
We used to have sports meetings. Ray used to run them. And I think Ev was called Titmole. I was called Percy Prick. Nev was called Ginger Pluck. Tim was called Tiny Tim. And Ray had described the race, you know. Here comes Titmoles. He's won by a tit or... And we used to play cricket in the backyard, in the back paddock, and use the stump of a tree for the wicket. And the old man had bowled us all out because he was a spinner like Warney. And we had no hope of hitting it. Why, gee, you could spin a ball, old Dad.
Carl travelled to Sydney in 1928 to represent the state in the final of the King's Medal for shooting. Unfortunately, he didn't win. The oldest son, Raymond, won a scholarship with the Independent Order of the Rechabites with an annual value of £16. This would have come as a great shock to his father, no doubt. The children attended a fancy dress ball for the Benalla West State School at the Memorial Hall, Harold as a scarecrow, and book prizes at the Holy Trinity Sunday School for Ray, Tim, Harold and Neville.
Yeah.
And I remember once the whole class at school came down to listen to the opening of Parliament in 1927.
That was State School 31.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they all sat along the veranda and he had the speaker, you know, the big speaker at the window.
Yeah.
And the old Queen Mother was out with her hubby for the opening.
In 1929 and 1930, Carl and Emmy continued their work in the community. Carl as a judge at the Back to Benalla Sports Day, and Emmy raising funds at a card night for the Benalla Croquet Club, a euchre party at the Drill Hall, and a Mothers Club meeting with Carl as MC and Mrs. Carnegie on the piano. And Carl continued his good form at shooting by winning the Captain's Medal at the local rifle club. In September of 1931, Emmy gave birth to their eighth child, Geoffrey John, and Warrant Officer Cogger attended the formation of the Yarrawonga 8th Light Horse.
You were shooting in those days? We had pea rifle and used to go out with the shotgun with old Jack Telekino shooting quail and rabbits. Yeah, we had a great time. And I used to go out with Jackie Truan on the back of his little old Ford, T model Ford, and pull up and shoot a rabbit from the road. There were that many rabbits about, you could shoot them when you pulled up in the car.
Really?
Hundreds of them, yeah. So we always caught rabbits. Well, Bunny Abbott and I used to go rabbiting, come home with about 20 pair of rabbits. And then we used to sell them, take them round all the neighbours and sell them a pair of rabbits for $2 a pair. Made a fortune. Then we used to sell the skins. Oh yeah. We had trailers on our bikes to take the ferrets and the nets, and then cart the rabbits home hanging down the side, blowflies all around them. Yeah, we used to catch 20 or 30 pair at weekend. Great. But you could eat them then and enjoy them. Beautiful.
In those days, the girls and boys would often go to school barefooted. Chicken was a delicacy saved for Christmas, New Year's Day and Easter. The children played games such as Cherry Bob, a game played with cherry pips, where they would try and throw pips into a hole in the ground. Another game was Tip Cat, where a bat would strike the end of a small piece of wood sharpened at both ends to make it fly in the air. The one who hit it the furthest was the winner.
I read books of westerns, and I used to play act the name of great cowboys, Buffalo Bill and all these people. And I had 2 wooden pistols that I'd shaped and stuck in me. And I used to go out, and in those days we had an outside dunny. And the old man used to sit there and roll a couple of cigarettes, and he'd sometimes leave the door open, and I didn't realise this, and I'd walk around with these things, and I'd look like this, and where are the pistols? and then I'd walk around again, and he sang out to me one day, "Well, what are you doing there? You look like Creeping Jesus." So forever after, I got Creeping Jesus.
The kitchen had a big fire stove, and in summer it became extremely uncomfortable, such as on Christmas Day when Carl would be cooking a turkey. He would always do the cooking on Christmas Day, as he was a caterer at some stage in the army. He made excellent cream puffs and sponges with 6 or more eggs. Of course he made a dreadful mess when cooking, and on one Christmas Day he was cooking cauliflower, and up crawled a snail out of the side of the pot.
And then next day we had stewed figs. He stewed some figs up for us. None of us could eat it. So he went out the toilet, so we all rushed out and tipped our figs out under the lantern bush. Said they were good, Dad. Oh, they were great. So what did he do? He dished us up another helping. Horrible stuff. Yeah.
An incident with Harold stopped Carl from attaining his driver's licence.
They were teaching him to drive once, and we're all following him up on the bikes, and of course he hit my front wheel and ran over my bike. Oh gosh, and he never got in a car since. Or he didn't try to drive since. I think he thought he'd run over me, but he didn't. He just buggered my bike up.
Whenever there was a parade day for the light horse in Benalla, Carl would invariably bring home one of the men for lunch or dinner.
I can remember that one time, Nana saw him, we said they saw him coming with this officer. She had to go round our plates and get a bit off each one to have enough for the visitor.
He always conned someone to drive him home from the pub, didn't he?
Yeah.
Carl would often go down to the local football and support the opposing team, just to annoy the family.
And then I remember one night Frank Chivers and Beryl, they had tea, and they were having tea, and Dad saying, "Oh, Benalla, you know, they couldn't play. Wangaratta beat them easily, and Wangaratta they had." And Frank got up and he said, "Bloody well ought to move to Wangaratta. That's what you want." Oh, he had a scoff.
As was the norm in those days, the family bathed only once a week.
We bathed about once a week. Yeah. And when we first started, there was no hot water. You just have to boil the copper up and then cast your hot water from the laundry and tip it through the bathroom window into the bath.
Carl and Emmy and the children would bathe in the same water.
Mum and Dad were both there, and I undressed and stepped into the bath, and the old man said, "What's that for?" And I said, "To pee through." And then I said, "Make sure that's all you do."
The children attended Benalla West School number 31, which was next to the Catholic school, and their children exchanged friendly banter.
We had a Catholic school next door, and we used to rattle on the tin shed and say, "You Catholic dogs sitting on logs eating maggots out of frocks." And they'd rattle back. I forgot what they used to say.
The Cogger children would take turns to holiday at Middle Park in a unit owned by the Benalla postmaster, Mr. McPhee.
No. I was about 14 when I first saw the sea, when McPhee's, he was a postmaster general in Benalla, and they used to invite me down for holidays. And I got the shock of my life when I first saw the sea. I thought, so much water, my God. I couldn't believe it.
When he left the 8th Light Horse in 1939, Carl was promoted to Sergeant Major and given a rousing farewell at the Benalla Drill Hall. Here are some of the comments made about him by his compatriots, as reported in the local paper. Mr. Frank Kay. The guest always possessed a buoyant nature and looked on things philosophically. It did not matter to Cog which way the wind blew, he always had a smile. Mr. Murray felt that Cog had played his part, for he had a family which nearly comprised a cricket team. He had also the makings of a football team. From what he had been told, the Defence Department had one of the best instructors in the state. Lieutenant Canning told of an incident in Sydney Road, Brunswick, when Carl and his horse ended up prone in a shop. Mr. Gunn said that he would miss him on a hot day, and he would not have anyone to come back and have a cool drink with him. Mr. McCrickard brought down the house when he said any one of the young Coggers was equal to 20 Germans. Mr. Burke said that he didn't know how they would get on with the sergeant's mess now that Cog was leaving. Lieutenant Nason stated that he had many recollections of pleasant evenings at the Cogger residence. He knew that they were carrying on the traditions of their father, for they showed good upbringing and the influence of home training predominated. In making the presentation of an Omega watch, he said that Warrant Officer Cogger was always 5 minutes before time, so he didn't require a watch to make him more punctual. On rising to respond, Warrant Officer Cogger was greeted with loud applause, and the audience sang, "Why was he born so beautiful?" And when he started to tell them how sorry he was to leave them, they interrupted with, "Your comrades don't believe you." When they settled down, there was silence, when he told them that he had a big tear to shed on leaving, when he looked back on 19 years ago, when he first started the first school in Benalla, following his return from the war. On his return, he thought he was a full-blown instructor, but even with his 5 years in Palestine, it was surprising how little he knew. All he had done, he was being paid for, and anything that he passed on had been a pleasure. He said he treasured the presents very much, and he had a soft spot in his heart for the 8th Light Horse. He said that he did not want to leave, and he wished them to understand that he did not wear the uniform for fun. It was his job, and he was a soldier. He brought forth much laughter by stating that ever if he had enough money, he would come back to Benalla and retire. In 1941, Carl was transferred to the 3rd Cavalry Band in Echuca, where his duties included instructing men on the driving of army trucks, rifle shooting, and the use of machine gun. However, Carl had never held a driving licence and more than likely had no idea of how to drive a truck. In October 1947, Emmy joined Carl in Mildura, where he was stationed at the drill hall, as mentioned in the Benalla Standard. In a video interview, Raymond suggested that his father had joined the SAS, Special Air Services, as a quartermaster, and in 1951, at the age of 58, he completed a parachute jump at Orange, New South Wales. According to the 1954 electoral roll, Carl, aged 61, was still in the army. In old age, Carl was a gruff old bugger who smoked roll-your-owns, sitting on the veranda at the old home listening to the races. On one occasion, as he watched his grandchildren strolling up Thomas Street, he admonished them for not swinging their arms as they walked. You couldn't take the army out of Carl. He would also reprimand them for their grammar. Don't say hey, hey makes a bullshit. He loved to bet with the SP bookies, and that was the main reason he was one of the first to own a radio set in Benalla. On the 30th of June 1966, at the age of 73, Carl passed away after suffering a heart attack when digging in the garden. In retirement, Carl had spent many hours at the Royal Hotel in Bridge Street, and as his funeral cortege passed, the drinkers came outside and raised their glasses to an old drinking comrade. In 1980, Emmy passed away aged 88 in Wangaratta. Carl and Emmy are buried together at Benalla Cemetery.